I'm Juliet, and in my Inclusive Leadership Welcome to the Table training, we define inclusive leadership as providing direction and setting an example for others to follow that deliberately seeks to create a strong mix of differences and then ensure that the mix works well together. So ultimately, inclusive leadership is about you and I as leaders creating an experience where everyone is welcome to the table and their differences and unique characteristics are embraced, valued, and leveraged in a way that benefits the entire organization. Employees benefit, teams benefit, customers, shareholders, well, everyone benefits when we set the example and effectively lead in this way. And there's so much that we cover in the training, but these support videos can be used either to reinforce the training if you took it, or independently, because here we simply highlight a few inclusive leadership tips that you and I can put into practice. So brace yourself, because tip number 1 is slap yourself to check your biases. Well, not literally, but we'll take a look at what S.L.A.P stands for in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at bias. Bias is something that we all have. It impacts every single one of us, as it's our tendency to make a personal judgment either in favor of or against one thing over another. So in many respects, these judgment calls that you and I make are just how we navigate life and process the abundance of information that we're bombarded with on a continuous basis. And we do it automatically and usually unconsciously. So biases in and of themselves are not a problem. But where the problem comes in is that, again, our biases lead to personal judgments, and sometimes those personal judgments, especially the ones that we make about other people, can be unfair and unreasonable. And we all have certain things that trigger our biases in a way that cause us to make unfair judgments about others, either in favor of or against. And since we all have them, the key is to first be honest with ourselves about what they are. Do you tend to make unfair or unreasonable judgments about others based on race? Like the stereotype that all Asians are good at math, for instance. Remember, a bias can be in favor of or against. Or what about gender? The stereotype that women are so emotional or less apt than men to be practical or rational? And so I know most of us are going to think that these aren't triggers for us, and it'll take some additional work to see and acknowledge our blind spots around some of these, which is way beyond the scope of this video. But what about something like accent? What's your judgment when you're talking with someone who has what you consider to be a strong accent that requires you to pay close attention in order to discern what they're saying? Or how about age, religion, height, weight, a person's educational background, a person with a disability, or a person who is LGBTQ? There are a host of differences about others that can trigger us to make unfair snap judgments about them. What are the things that trigger bias for you in this way? Again, we all have them. And when you and I are honest enough with ourselves to be able to call them out, even if in just the quietness of our minds, the things that trigger us to make unfair snap judgments about others, this is the first step toward checking our biases. Now, this is where S.L.A.P comes into play. S.L.A.P is a mnemonic device that we can use in those moments when our biases are triggered to help ensure that our quick judgments about others become a little more objective, hopefully leading to a more fair and reasonable assessment. So now S stands for slow down, and think about how and why that area, that characteristic, be it accent, race, gender, height, weight, education, or whatever, why that is a trigger for you in that moment. In other words, don't rush past it, but give yourself a moment to hold up the mirror. Now, L stands for listen. Listen to your internal voice and what your reaction is when triggered. So when you are triggered, how does this play out for you? What unfair or snap judgments are you making in that moment? Don't just ignore it, but slow down and listen to yourself. A stands for acknowledge your bias and how it can impact your assessment or decision making. This is where you're honest with yourself about how your biases have surfaced and really think about what the impact could be as a result. And P stands for provide a more objective assessment or response in the moment. And this is what taking that brief moment to slow down and go through this process is intended to lead you to making a more objective, fair, and reasonable assessment or decision. So slow down, listen, acknowledge your bias, and provide a more objective assessment. S.L.A.P. Now that wasn't so bad. Now, why is this important? It's important because for you and I to be inclusive leaders, we're not expected to be perfect because, again, bias affects all of us in some way. But we must become more conscious and aware of those moments when our personal judgments are causing us to make unfair and unreasonable assessments and decisions, especially about others. As leaders, the reality is that part of our responsibility is to make judgment calls about people. We have to decide who to hire, who to promote, who should succeed us, who we should put on what project teams. We have to rate performance and give feedback. So we have to make these leadership decisions on an ongoing basis. But it's our responsibility to also make sure that we're making good decisions that are as objective as possible and based upon good information, as opposed to decisions that are purely personal judgments that are prone to bias and unfairness. So the next time you have to make one of these critical leadership decisions, before your next interview, or before you start your performance review process or talent review process, or decide who to put on what project teams, or whatever the situation that you're in, where you have to provide a more objective decision, I would encourage you to pause just long enough to slap yourself. Ultimately, it's about building self-awareness and personal accountability. And imagine the advancements in sustaining an inclusive environment that we could make if we all slap ourselves regularly.